Thanks for stopping by today. If you are new to the channel, there are some affiliate links below. They just help support me, help support the channel, and I appreciate you checking those out. Today, this video is something new, something a little different, because today I am talking with Jonathan Cornell from Immersive Audio Album. Jonathan and I met in Nashville recently for an immersive audio event. Jonathan is the director of music with IAA, and we got to talking and thought we ought to sit down and chat and maybe do a little video on it. So I don't normally do interviews, so this is kind of a new thing, but if you like this, if you enjoy it, if you think maybe I should do some more interviews, please let me know in the comments below. But enough of that, here's our chat. So Jonathan, most of the people watching videos on my channel, they're engineers. So why am I talking to you today? Can you tell everybody a little bit about what you do and how you're involved in Dolby Atmos and immersive audio?
Sure. So for the past couple of years, I've been running an online platform called Immersive Audio Album. We just call it IAA for short. But the site is a online web store, kind of like Bandcamp, or really more like some of the higher end, like download-based services like HD Tracks or Qobuz or Pro Studio Masters. There's a bunch of these. But as of now, I think we're the only site where you can buy a Dolby Atmos album as a high-res digital file. Because I'm pretty sure Bandcamp doesn't support spatial audio, like unless you give them like a binaural stereo file.
Yeah, I don't think they do it yet. I always like saying yet with everything.
Yeah. It's like, when is Spotify going to support Atmos streaming? Same idea. But to give you a little more context behind this and like why I think there's a need in the market for this service. It's sort of interesting how this whole immersive music thing has changed over the last couple of years. So for people who don't know, like, it's immersive music is not a new thing. It's been around for a long time, for decades. And I did on my own podcast, we did a whole episode charting the history of immersive music going back to the 1940s until today. But in recent years, if you wanted to buy an album that was mixed in 5.1 before Atmos, you would have to buy like a special kind of disc to play it. There were these formats that came out really around the year 2000. There's something called a Super Audio CD, something called a DVD audio, and then later on Blu-ray audio. And there is a dedicated fan base of people who have home theater systems that would buy these albums to listen to a special surround mix of the album. And typically these discs would be included in like larger box sets. Like if you remember, a couple of the Beatles albums were reissued the last couple of years, like Sgt. Pepper, the White Album, Abbey Road, with new stereo mixes by Giles Martin. And at the same time, he also mixed them in 5.1. And you can get those 5.1 mixes on a Blu-ray that come with the Super Deluxe box. But since like Atmos kind of exploded for music in 2021, when Apple Music started supporting it, the new trend is that the Atmos mixes only go to the streaming services. Now, granted, there are still some box sets that come with Blu-rays that have Atmos or 5.1. There are some artists like Steven Wilson who release their music on a standalone Blu-ray disc you could buy. But the vast majority of Dolby Atmos mixed albums are only accessible on streaming services. So there's kind of two issues with this for me. One is that you can't buy them. Like, it's sort of like you're forever renting your music. And the other issue is that they use a lossy codec to stream the Atmos mixes. Now, granted, this could eventually change. But without getting into the specifics and bit rates and things, the audio you would get on a Blu-ray, which uses this other codec called Dolby True HD, does sound a lot better than what you would stream on Apple Music. The idea behind the site is I'm often approaching so I'll go on Apple Music and I'll look for usually independent artists or labels. And pretty much everybody is producing music in Atmos nowadays. And I'll approach them and I'll say, well, there's a dedicated market of people who would be interested in actually buying this, like as a one-time purchase, for $20. And whenever someone buys from our site, you get 80% of the sale. So for one thing, it's a good way to introduce your music to a new audience, because the audience of people who are interested in surround Blu-rays and downloads are quite fanatical. I would say there are some people I've seen from reading forums that will just buy anything that's released in surround. And also, you'll generate more revenue from the Atmos mix, because on streaming services, what is it? You get like a fraction of a cent every time somebody streams your track.
Maybe probably depends on the streaming service. With some of them, you don't
like
get
that.
enough streams, you don't get anything. There's a joke with audiophiles, I think, that audiophiles buy music to listen to their gear. I don't think that's generally the case, though, with people who have set up, surround setups or immersive setups at home. Are people interested in listening to music, or is it just like a gimmicky kind of thing, trying to make their gear work?
It depends. I mean, I can't, speak for everybody but like from my own experience, the first time I heard it, it was like songs that I already knew that were famous, which I think is part of the reason why the labels are so intent on doing these remixes of older catalog albums, because it's sort of like a gateway drug to get people interested in. Like when 5.1 came out, one of the first 5.1 albums was Queen's A Night at the Opera. So I think they were hoping people would invest in a surround system just to hear, Bohemian Rhapsody happening all around you. And then once you have all the gear already, it's like, well, not only can you buy all these old remixes of albums but you could also listen to immersive mixes of new music. So, I think to better answer your question, like a good mix can't save music that you don't like. Like the
Right.
prime example I always point to people is there was a Britney Spears album that came out with a 5.1 mix in the early 2000s.
Wow.
And it's a fantastic surround mix. Like it's a mix that's so good. Like I would demo my system with it, but that doesn't mean I like the music.
Do you know who did the mix?
It was mixed by a guy called Chris Haynes.
Okay.
I've never met him. I don't know. He also did he did a 5.1 mix of Motorhead's Ace of Spades, which also came out in DVD. It's also a great mix.
Well, and those are very, very similar genres of music right there. So
Totally. Yeah.
if someone wants to put their music up on IAA, what's the process for that? Like, can anybody basically just do it, or, how does that work?
So typically the way it starts is most of the music on the site is a result of me like doing outbound, cold emails to people. Though we do get some inbounds as well. But basically if you go on the site, and I'll give you the URL so you could drop it in the description. There's a screen where like you could begin the process of applying to become a vendor. And there's on my side, I see there's a vendor queue, and I can, it'll ask for information like what format is your album mixed in? Like, is it 5.1 or Atmos? What kind of music is it? And I have like a queue I see on my side, and from there I can approve you. And then usually we just get into an email conversation, kind of like the conversation we're having now, where people ask me like, what are the deliverables? Do you need additional assets? Like, do you need like videos? Do you need cover art? Do you need ISRC codes? All the usual things you would submit to any distributor when you're releasing music. Eventually, once we get like the accounting set up, so the site uses the Stripe system to send payouts. And we just kind of work out the details over email, and I build the product page on my album, and we launch it at the agreed upon date.
So what does someone who's purchasing an album, what are they getting?
So, I mean, it depends on whether the album is 5.1 or Atmos or Oro 3D, but for the sake of simplicity, we'll just assume Atmos, because most of the products on the site are mixed in Atmos. So, I don't want to get too into the weeds with technical stuff, but since the audience is primarily like, people on the creator side, as you were telling me, as everyone knows, the deliverable when you actually mix a record in Atmos is something called an ADM file. It stands for like audio definition model or something like that. Right. I think that's what it stands for.
Yeah, that's it.
But basically, it's just like, it's a big WAV file. where all the beds and the objects in the mix are just contained as separate tracks. So depending on how you've done the mix, and it's not uncommon for people to do mixes with all objects. Like it could be a huge file, because if you did your mix with all objects, you'd essentially be giving someone like the multi-track. And when you load this file that has all the bed and object data into this computer program called the Dolby renderer, it will understand how to map that information to whatever, output system you're listening to. It could be a 714 speaker array, or it could be headphones. So where it gets interesting is that the signal flow for how Atmos works in like a home consumer environment is different than in the studio. In the studio, it's like you're sending the output of, your DAW, or you're playing back a finished ADM through the Dolby renderer. And, it's basically, if you're on a 714 system, it's 12 discrete signals that are going over, line outputs to powered speakers. I think that's typically, most studios have powered speakers, right? For the most part.
Yeah. These days, a lot of it is. I mean, we've still got some folks who are on passive speakers, but it's a lot of amplification to do it for immersive. But I can think of some people who would be.
It'd be interesting to make an Atmos system using 11 NS10s.
Jesse Ray Ernster, I believe, had that set up in.
Oh, wow.
Not the studio he's in right now, but it was a lot of NS10s, and they were mounted creatively to get the height channels, I guess is the best way to put it. I don't think he's doing that anymore, but I do know he had a lot of NS10s for a while and was doing that. So,
well, funny enough, I read an interview with Elliot Shiner from years ago, and he said that he mixed Steely Dan's Gaucho in 5.1 using 5 NS10s. And that's considered, one of the greatest 5.1 mixes of all time. So, but anyway, so in order to play an Atmos mix on a consumer setup, basically the way it works is based on this process called HDMI bitstream, where the Dolby renderer software is built into the like amp that you buy. Or if you're not using like a typical like amp receiver, it's built into like your soundbar. And you have to play like a Dolby encoded file over an HDMI cable into your gear. And then inside the gear, it decodes it into however many speakers you have. So when you listen to Atmos music with an Apple TV, you're getting Dolby Digital Plus, the lossy codec, which is the same thing you would get if you export an MP4 from the Dolby renderer. That's like the lower resolution version. If you listen to Atmos on a Blu-ray, it uses this other codec called Dolby True HD, which is high res. So to answer your question, what do you get when you download an album from IAA? You get the entire album in 2 different file sets. You get something called an MKV file, which is like a open source audio video container. The MKV files have the Dolby True HD audio, which is like what you would get on a Blu-ray. And the MP4 files have the lossy Dolby Digital Plus, which is what you would get from streaming services. But the twist is that you can play the MP4s on headphones if you want. So if you take a bunch of these Atmos MP4 files and you stick them on your phone, like you put them in a Google Drive folder, or on like, how the iPhones have like a Files app.
Right.
And this, for some reason, you have to save them offline. I don't know why the system forces this. But if you have an MP4 file saved offline on your iPhone and you're listening with AirPods, it will decode into spatial audio as if you're listening with Apple Music or Tidal or whatever.
That's something that I know a lot of us who are working in Atmos, we talk about kind of the complicated process sometimes to listen to those files. So when somebody purchases an album, do you have instructions that come with it, like to help somebody figure out how to play it back? Like, or do the people who are purchasing generally, do they understand what an MKV file is? I mean, I understand what an MKV is because I play them back in my home theater, but I I know that there are going to be people watching this right now who are working in Atmos. They have no idea what an MKV is. How does that work on the consumer side? Are they more familiar with it if they've got that kind of setup? Do you hold their hands through getting it to play back at all?
Oh yeah. So if you go on the blog on the site, we've done a bunch of articles over the years with instructions, explaining all the stuff I just told you, like what's true HD, what's an MKV, how do you play it. Alternatively, like you could always just write to us. Like I handle all the customer support for the website and I respond very quickly, and people who've worked with me can attest. As far as like consumer knowledge levels, it varies. In some cases we're dealing with people who have huge collections of Blu-ray and SACD discs, and they know how to like copy the files off their discs, and they're listening with like media servers. There are some people who have a very high knowledge level, and there are some people who are just used to like putting a disc in the player, and the whole concept of like not having a disc and having files is new to them, but they know about surround. And then, beyond that, there are some people who only know of Atmos as like a headphone thing. So we're trying to reach all those potential customers across the various, because that's the great thing about Atmos. It's such an adaptive format that it has a larger, market segmentation than 5.1 did. But to your point, it is kind of complicated to explain how to play it in all these different places.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that that's going to get easier over time. But, kind of is what it is, I think, in some ways. But, I've had a media server at my house on our home theater for a while. And once you figure it out, I can just throw stuff in a folder on the server and it just shows up for me in an app on my Apple TV. And I can watch stuff or listen to stuff or, whatever I am trying to do.
Yeah, I mean, once you go discless, like it's hard to go back. Like I used to be old school, like putting my discs in a player. In fact, at my house in New York, where I grew up and where all my collection of surround discs is, I had one of those 400 disc like spinning things, like a
Yeah.
carousel, and I had all my surround discs in it. At this point, like I haven't played a disc in years. Like I have everything on like a 5 terabyte drive. Just plug the drive in. I mean, that's another thing. Like, you don't have to have a media server. What I tell people often is that so think of it as we're trying to convert people who are used to playing Blu-ray discs. A lot of Blu-ray players will play MKV files, like they have a USB port on the front, and you could
That's
just
true.
plug like a drive or stick in. So I'll tell people to try that. Alternatively, if your Blu-ray player won't play these files, which some don't, Ryan Oliate turned me on to this little device made by a company called Numi. They sell it on Amazon. I think it's about $50 at the moment. But it's like this little HDMI dongle. You plug one port into your receiver or soundbar or whatever. And then on the front, it has a USB port and an SD port. So you could put your files on either kind of those removable storage. And it'll play Atmos files over HDMI bitstream. I mean, the UI for it is pretty basic, but it's a really cheap, easy way to get into this.
That's cool. So are you guys only doing downloads or are you selling discs as well?
We had a couple of products where the artist had discs already, and it was just like a drop shipping agreement. Like we would process the order and then they would ship the disc. But I think the cost is prohibitive. Like I wouldn't even know where to start, like who to contact for authoring, how to get them manufactured. But I'll tell you something that's interesting, and part of the reason why we're doing this is that it seems like for every year since Atmos blew up in 2021, there have been more Blu-rays every year. So a lot of people like ask me, like, do you really think there's a market for this, like high-res downloads? And it's kind of like, well, I mean, if you look at all the stuff that's getting released on Blu-ray every year, I mean, all the Rhino, which is Warner Brothers catalog division, are releasing standalone Atmos Blu-ray discs now. There's this company called Super Deluxe Edition in England that they have a partnership, I think, with Universal and with BMG, where they've done a bunch of Atmos Blu-rays of catalog and new titles. So it seems like there is like a sizable audience beyond just people listening to spatial audio with headphones who don't know anything about home theaters.
That's good. I like hearing that for sure. There is definitely a difference that I've heard between kind of the lossy Dolby Digital Plus stuff and True HD. I mean, I can hear it just in movies, because these days, you buy movies, a lot of times they come with that digital download, and I still collect Blu-rays, not as much as I used to, but a lot of times I may get the download code and you go, oh, I'll just watch it online because it's easier. And every once in a while, I'll go and put the actual disc in, and it's like, oh, wow, this sounds better. This looks better. I think streaming is definitely a convenience thing, and I'm glad it exists for Atmos.
It's great. It's great being able to sample how a surround mix sounds before you buy it.
Yeah.
Because that's something that never happened before. Because if you think about when I really got into this, like in I guess the mid 2010s, like 2014, 2015, like you'd read online, like Jimi Hendrix's Electric Ladyland is being reissued on a box set with a 5.1 mix, which was like huge news when that was announced because I love that record. But Eddie Kramer did the surround mix of it, and he had like never done a surround mix before. So like, who knows if it would be good?
Right.
So it's kind of like you would have to take a chance because the surround discs were usually part of like an elaborate deluxe reissue that could, in some cases, cost more than $100. So it's kind of like, well, you kind of just have to take a chance and hope that you like the mix. And, there have certainly been examples for me where I bought stuff and I thought it didn't sound good for one reason or another. So it's kind of cool, like on the same day that these box sets come out now. Like a couple years ago, there was the Who's Next box set that had the Steven Wilson mix of the album. It was great, to be spared spending $300 and just go on Apple Music and listen to it on release day. So yeah, I do like that part of it. And at the end of the day, the reason these mixes are being done is because of streaming. And whatever else comes of it beyond that, whether it gets released on Blu-ray or on our site, is just kind of a byproduct of the deliverable already existing for streaming.
Yeah, I do wish right now there are some things that I know are getting remixed. And as much as I think those of us who are working in Atmos, we think, oh, everything in Atmos, it's going to hit Apple Music, it's going to hit Amazon and Tidal. It doesn't actually. I think there are a lot of releases that, like I had to go to hear the Ziggy Stardust Atmos mix that
it's only on the Blu-ray.
It was only on the Blu-ray,
yeah.
And I waited and waited for it to show up in Apple Music because I really wanted to hear what Emery and Ken Scott did with that, but I had to go on Amazon and order the Blu-ray. That's one of those places where I wish things would get a little more standardized. I feel like there might have been some stuff that Steven Wilson did. Well, I know there's a bunch of stuff that Steven Wilson did that I wanted to hear that is not on Apple Music.
Yeah, all the King Crimson stuff doesn't go to Apple Music. That's just the DGM, the company that controls that stuff. They're kind of anti-streaming.
Yeah, some of the labels aren't doing it.
The XTC stuff hasn't gone to streaming
right.
yet either, I don't think. It's too bad because I would say XTC's The Big Express might be my favorite Atmos mix of a vintage record.
Wow.
I mean, it's kind of difficult music. Like, it's not the first album I'd recommend to people who've never heard of that band, but that Atmos mix is really something.
Yeah, I think you and I, we could sit around and talk a bit about our appreciation for Steven Wilson's remixes. But let's not get too specific on that right now. What do you think, for somebody, like, if you had to recommend like 5 to 10 albums that are immersive for somebody to check out, maybe stuff that sold in your shop, what would you tell people to listen to?
Well, I would break it down. I'd probably want to give people like a couple of new albums and a couple of old ones. So as far as stuff sold on our sites, as for an old album, most recently we did Ray Charles's Genius Loves Company, which I was able to get through a connection with Michael Romanowski, who I think both of us know.
Yeah. And that was a
And
Grammy
that
nomination too. Like that was
yeah,
that was nominated for Best Immersive Album last year.
so that was a huge get for us. And Eric Schilling did that mix, and it sounds great, really well done. As far as new stuff, one of my favorites is a couple years ago I found out about this band based out of Canada called Monkey House.
Okay.
They're kind of, I would say their music is kind of in the style of Steely Dan, kind of like a mix of jazz and rock, bits of R&B, like there's a horn section. They're signed to this independent label called Alma Records. They're based in Canada, and I had found out that their last album, which came out in 2022, was released with an Atmos mix, and it's a really really good mix. Like the horns are in the back, backing vocals are all around you. It sounds fantastic. And I had tried to get in touch with them because I thought this would be like a good thing for us to try to get for IAA. And it turned out that all the Atmos mix was done by the same guy who recorded the album. His name's John Bailey, the engineer. And they had been in the process of remixing the whole label's catalog in Atmos. So it ended up being this great partnership for us. And I think so far there's 9 or 10 titles from Alma that are available on IAA. Some of them are only on IAA, not on the streaming services. But I would definitely recommend the new Monkey House album that came out last week. It's called Crashbox. It's on Apple Music and on IAA.
Oh, cool.
We did the Church's latest album. It's called The Hypnagogue. If you're familiar with the Church, they were like this 80s kind of new wave band. I think Bob Clearmountain produced like one of their either their first or second album. Their newest record, which is this kind of like super trippy concept album. It takes place like in the future. The Atmos was mixed by Daryl Thorpe. It's also like a really good mix. And I don't know. I mean, pretty much anything Steven Wilson has done.
Right.
So, the Tears for Fears,
Yeah.
Songs for the Big Chair and the Hurting, the XTC stuff, Who's Next, and his newest album, The Overview. Oh, God, there's so many. I mean, what are some of yours?
Oh man. Yeah, the Steven Wilson stuff for sure. The Tears for Fears, yeah, Songs from the Big Chair came out great. I'm waiting for him to do Sowing the Seeds. Like he did it in 5/1 a few years ago. I feel like they released the 5/1 just as Atmos was kind of starting to hit on the music side. And I want to hear it in full Atmos. I think he did a great job with the 5/1, but I want to hear the whole thing.
It was delayed for a long time, and I know this because I interviewed him.
Right.
The 5/1 of Seeds of Love was done in like 2015 or 2014, and for some reason it took a very long time to come out. The box set came out during the pandemic. I remember.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense because it was right on the edge of that. Atmos kind of starting to really hit.
But from what I've heard, it seems like the band themselves, Roland and Kurt, they like surround and Atmos. So I think they will eventually do the whole catalog. The one I want to hear is their comeback album they made around the year 2000. It's called Everybody Loves a Happy Ending. That's also like a super layered, like the Seeds of Love. It has a lot of like sort of Beatles influence. And another reason why is because it's one of those mixes that was done during like the Loudness Wars era, so it's very compressed. So it would be interesting even to hear a remixed stereo version of that has more, dynamics and clarity.
That's always nice, in my opinion.
Yes. But I'll tell you though, if I had to recommend one mix that Steven has done, that's probably my favorite, aside from the XTC, is the Grateful Dead American Beauty.
Okay.
And as of now, it's only on Apple Music. I hope they do a Blu-ray of it eventually. But that is like a amazing mix. And, that record always sounded great, no matter what you played on. The original vinyl was fantastic, but the Atmos mix is really amazing. And there's more layers on it than you might think. Some of the songs, there's 3 or 4 vocal parts, a couple of guitars, piano, lots of stuff to work with.
I'm going to have to check that out. I don't know if I have a playlist that I keep on Apple Music of all the stuff that he does, because I really, like, for me as a mixer, his stuff is kind of reference level. There's a, he's not the only one. I'll say that, because I don't want to ignore some of my friends. But
I mean, I'll give you a bunch more. Ryan Elliott's mixes of the Tom Petty catalog.
Oh yeah,
and his own record, which we have on IA, is called Act 3. So that's definitely one of the new records I would recommend, because it was kind of recorded for Atmos. Not in the sense that like he put up a bunch of like room mics when he was recording things, but like he intentionally like kind of overlayered a lot of the songs, so there's a lot of stuff to put in the extra channels. So that's a really good one, and that was also nominated for a Grammy. Bob Clear Mountain.
yeah,
So
yeah.
Roxy Music's Avalon just came out in Atmos.
Anybody who's watched any of my content, they know that I'm kind of unashamed in my appreciation of Bob's stuff. And I went to a master class for Atmos with him last year, I think, and that was great for me because I got to hear everything in Blackbird up in Nashville, and it was kind of frustrating at the time because a lot of the stuff he was playing hadn't come out, but most of it is out now. He played us. I think we listened to Avalon when I was there, and it was probably, I don't know, it might have been 6 months before that actually released. But I don't know that Roxy Music is for everybody, but I think what he did with that record is great, and the stuff that he did that nobody talks about that I'd like in Atmos is he did a Duran Duran record.
It's called the Halloween record. It's called Danza Macabra. I think that's how you say it, something like that. Yeah. I want to hear the vintage Duran Duran stuff in Atmos.
Yeah, that would be kind of cool.
Yeah.
But that's one I like, and the stuff that the Huey Lewis and the new stuff he did, I think that stuff came out really good. But the thing, and this maybe leads us to something else I wanted to talk about. The thing about Bob that is interesting to me is, he started in 5.1 pretty early on. And I feel like with a lot of the guys who are working in Atmos today, they missed all of that, like all of the 5.1 stuff that has been done. And it's like sometimes when I'm talking to engineers in Atmos, I feel like they're like, wow, this surround thing is brand new, and where did it come from? And I have to sit there and go, nah, it kind of started with Fantasia back in the I think it was in the 30s. Yeah. So
for quad.
Yeah, or quad, at least with music, in the 70s. Surround, immersive. I've been calling everything surround immersive now.
Some people get mad when you interchange them, but I've been kind of calling everything immersive. So sorry if anyone. Yeah.
Well, I kind of feel like it's all marketing terms anyways. So, and the goal to me in a lot of ways, what we've been trying to achieve with moving to more and more speakers, I guess, around us, it's always been, I think, to make music or movies, just any kind of sound, more immersive. Like, that's been the goal. I think we just started calling it immersive as a way to differentiate from surround, because surround was all ear level, and it's like, oh, what do we call it? Because we added some height channels. It's like, it's immersive, but you don't need the thing about Atmos, and you kind of talked about this a little bit too, I think. The thing about Atmos is it's such a scalable format. I can take something in Atmos and put it on in my home theater. I mean, my home theater's Atmos now, but it was only 5.1 for a long time, and you can listen to this in so many different ways. But, getting back to where I was going, I feel like there's a lot of guys who missed kind of everything that happened in 5.1. And I think there are some learning opportunities that have been missed as a result of that. Are there things, like if you think about all the 5.1 stuff that's been done over the last, 20 years, let's say, I mean, really 25 years, because it was kind
Yeah.
of late 90s, early 2000s when that stuff was happening. But when you listen to those mixes, are there things in some of those old 5.1 mixes that maybe modern immersive mixers aren't taking advantage of? Are there things that modern immersive mixes sometimes, maybe it's almost like they're afraid to do, whereas with some of those older 5.1s, it was like there was not any kind of fear in what they were doing?
Well, for one thing, you can't really blame people for not having listened to that stuff because there's nowhere to get it.
Right.
It took me years to collect all my 5.1 discs. When I got started with this, and the reason why I love all this stuff was because my dad loved it. My dad was a teenager in the 70s, and he had a quad setup and a pretty big collection of records, which I still have, and all the gear you need to play them. And if you think playing stuff in Atmos is hard, playing record and quad is beyond. But we had a small collection of 5.1 discs that came out in the early 2000s. Like he had like Billy Joel's The Stranger, which Frank Filippetti mixed. It's a great mix, and he's still doing Atmos nowadays.
Right.
There were a couple classic albums that Elliot Shiner did. Like he did the Eagles' Hotel California. We talked about Steely Dan's Gaucho before. Bob did a bunch of stuff then. He did Avalon and 5.1. He did a bunch of like newer albums that came out in the early 2000s. One of my favorites is, I'm guessing like no one has heard this. There's a record by a band called the Indigo Girls. It's called
Oh,
All That We Let In, that Bob did the 5.1 mix for. It's a great record, kind of like a folk rock kind of thing. It came out in an SA CD, in 2001 or 2002. So yeah, there's a lot of great stuff from that time. Oh, Chuck Ainlay's mix of Dire Straits' Brothers in Arms, which was just remixed again in Atmos. But the Chuck's mix won a Grammy back in 2005 for Best
right.
Surround Album. So yeah, to your point, there's a lot of great stuff from that time. A lot of those albums have since been mixed again in Atmos because they always, go back to the best-selling catalog evergreens. There are some albums that have been mixed 3 times now in Quad, 5.1, and Atmos.
Right.
But probably the biggest difference is that when you're mixing in 5.1, the only thing you have to worry about is how it sounds out of the 5 speakers. Like no
Right.
one really cared about like a stereo fold down of a 5.1 mix. I think if you were mixing like a movie, you'd want to consider that because you never know if somebody was like playing the DVD through a system that didn't have surround, so the surround mix was getting folded down. But I think for film, they would also do a dedicated stereo mix. I mean, I don't know that much about the film mixing world. I'm more of a music guy. But I mean, with Atmos, you have to worry about all these different scenarios. And, I've interviewed a lot of engineers for the site. Some people tell me like they just value 714 monitoring and nothing else, which I think is kind of a risky move. And other people have told me they have these convoluted, way of doing it where they'll start on headphones, then they'll switch to speakers, then they'll go back to headphones at the end. Some people have told me that they check all the different re-renders. So like say you're mixing in 714, like you'll check how it sounds in 5.1, you'll check how it sounds in regular stereo, like with no binaural rendering.
Yeah, I'm guilty of that.
So I think maybe the reason why some of the old 5.1 mixes were more adventurous was because the only thing they had to worry about was how it sounded in 5.1. But as far as like I can say, and I mean I put my record of surround listening against anyone. I think as far as stuff on disc it goes, I've heard just about everything.
Hmm.
I mean, with streaming now, it's hard to keep up with all the different albums that are coming out in Atmos because basically every new album is an Atmos mix. But I think I've heard just about every reputable album that's come out on a surround disc, and a lot of them are like unadventurous mixes, like some of the Atmos ones where all the sounds are in the front and there's just reverb in the back. Like that wasn't
Yeah.
uncommon then either. I mean, the
Okay.
ones that are more adventurous were kind of the exception, like the stuff that like Elliot and Bob and all those people were doing. On the flip side, the 70s quad mixes, if you've heard any of those, are all over the place. Because I think the thing with quad was that the four speakers were all large. So you think about in the 70s, there were no like satellite speakers and subwoofers. They were just like big speakers, right? So the four corners get treated with equal weight. So in a lot of quad mixes, like it's not uncommon for drums to be in the back, for like the bass guitar to be in the back. There are some mixes where the vocals are in the back. And when you move into, these modern mixes in either 5.1 or Atmos, where people are listening with bass management, and maybe they have big front speakers, but like little satellites in the rears. I think maybe the mixers started thinking like, well, the speakers in front are bigger, like, so that's where all like the important stuff should go. So I think that's another part of it too. And Atmos kind of helps get away from that because there's the whole idea of like you're mixing with objects in like an undefined space.
Dolby has said, like, we're supposed to treat everything like it's all full range. So kind of like the quad scenario where, in theory, as engineers, we're not supposed to worry about, like, oh, they've got giant like, if I think about my home theater where I've got, like, towers in the front and, the speakers that are on my wall in the back for the surrounds, they are definitely smaller, and the ones on the ceiling, those are smaller still. But we're supposed to treat it all like it's all a full range thing.
You can't put a tower on the ceiling, right?
Right.
I mean, people have come up with some creative solutions, for hanging like full range bookshelf speakers. At what was it? At the thing we were at in Nashville with those guys from Dolby. They were talking about room setups. One of them was like, I mounted like a 2x4 on my wall and I put a speaker bracket on that. So, people have come up with some interesting, DIY options. I mean, I live in a rental, so I can't drill holes in the ceiling. So what I did was I got some really tall bookshelves, and I just put like a regular speaker up there and pointed it down. You can see a little bit here. It's one of my height speakers in the corner there.
I've seen some very creative ways of mounting height channels. I know that was my least favorite thing to do in my studio. It was a lot easier on the home theater side, surprisingly, probably because they were much smaller speakers and I didn't have to worry about the mounting the same way.
I would argue, like, if I was trying to convince someone who knew nothing about any of this to invest in gear, I wouldn't tell them that they need height speakers.
Yeah.
I think all you need is something in the back. I think if you have a sound bar in the front and like two rears, like that's good enough for most people. That's better than pretty much anything they've heard, right?
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to start. And these days with all like the wireless setups, it's so much easier to do it at home than like when I was running wires all over the living room trying to get it to work. I still have that in my home theater kind of, but that's definitely a different story.
When Atmos first came out, like I was reluctant to mess with my 5.1 system and add more speakers because I thought it sounded good. And also like I didn't know like how people would take advantage of it. Like when you think about it, like what do you put in the ceiling on a music mix? And people have different ideas about this. Like do you use it? Do you treat it like it's its own place for like sort of isolated bits and pieces of things? Or do you treat it kind of like it's all one thing and the heights are just kind of there to partially pull stuff up? I mean, I've heard mixes that you sort of use both strategies. There are some Atmos mixes that don't really use the heights at all. They just use them for like reverb returns and things. But I mean, I'm a proponent of like treating them like they're their own area to put, distinct sounds. I think it's very cool when that's done well.
So let me ask you a question while we're talking about mixes. Are there particular characteristics that like you find when you're listening to surround and immersive mixes, just as a fan, are there particular characteristics that you hear in mixes that make you go, wow, this one is great? And what are the characteristics that like the people who are buying these albums and just who've been listening to surround and immersive for a couple of decades now, what are the things that they kind of gravitate towards? When people are when people are talking in forums about the kind of the revered sort of 5.1 and Atmos mixes, are there things in those mixes that sort of set them apart from the kind of safe, I'm just going to put everything on the front wall and, little ambience all around kind of approaches?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't speak for everybody, and there are some kind of diverging tastes if you read these forums or like Reddit groups and things. There's Facebook groups. There is quite a sizable online community that exists just to talk about these mixes, which I find interesting. But I mean, a big part of it with the old records is like making sure it sounds like the record that you remember,
Mm-hmm.
which can be quite tricky if you've ever seen like what a raw multi-track looks like for an old song. Sometimes when you press play on it, it sounds nothing like the final song.
Oh, yeah. I know.
So I think a lot of people kind of interpret old mixes sounding bad as like the engineer kind of like ran amok, like they tried to make it sound like what they wanted and not how the original sounds. But I think the real reason is that it's just hard to match the original. And with the old stuff, it's a tricky balance. Like you want it to sound like the song that you knew, like that it used all the right takes of things. And there's like a moment where like they wrote a fader up, like there's a tom that should jump out or a guitar. Like you want all that stuff to be there, but you also want to have some like new insight into it that you didn't have before. Because when the parts are spread out, you can kind of hear how they fit together. If
Mm-hmm.
there's like a lead vocal in the front and harmonies behind you, you could hear more of those parts. Or if there's different layers of things, like I kind of like to hear how the cake was made at the same time as I'm listening to it, but I don't want it to sound like it's too spread apart. So it's very hard to find that balance, but some people like who we've talked about are very good at doing it, I think.
Yeah.
But like, what do I want to hear? I mean, honestly, like I want all the speakers to be doing something. Like I know it sounds kind of elementary, but you put in the work to set up those speakers. You want to hear them
Right.
doing something.
Right.
But at the same time, like there are some things that don't work. Like it's rare that putting drums in the back sounds good. Granted, there are some vintage mixes, like I said, where it's kind of cool, but I've yet to hear a modern Atmos mix where someone put all the drums in the back and it sounded good.
Yeah, I feel like there was someone did it. I can't remember what the song was. And they had a reason for doing it. Like they had kind of flipped the whole thing around.
I
And
think
and
it's cool if it's like an album that was recorded, later in the 70s or 80s where they were using more mics. If you put like the main kit in the front and you put some of like the toms in the back or something like that can sound cool. There are some mixes that have done that. I mean, generally I like to hear like separation between different layers of vocals. Like the main part in front and the harmonies could be either in the top or in the back. One thing that's interesting about 5.1 versus Atmos is that Atmos, if you're listening in 714, it has those speakers on the sides, right? So
Mhm.
there's side surrounds and there's rear surrounds. And in 5.1, I think the position of the back speakers was closer to where the rear surrounds are in
Yes.
Atmos. So they're not next to you, they're behind you. And this is a whole other issue because when you play a 5.1 mix through a 7.1 receiver, the stuff in the rear comes out of the sides and not the back. So, a lot of people sort of think that's sort of against the intentions of how it was supposed to sound, but whatever. Since the side speakers are closer to the front, I find you can get away with like putting stuff in those that wouldn't work in the back in a 5.1 mix. So you think about a lot of these old records from the early 70s, like Who's Next? On the Who's Next record, there's this song called Love Ain't for Keeping. And it's
Mhm.
a relatively simple, I think it's mono drums, two acoustic guitars, and a couple of backing vocals is all there is on it. So if you were to do a 5.1 mix of this song, I mean, it was probably recorded on 8 track, in 1970 or 71. If you do a 5-1 mix and you put all the guitars in the back, it would just be like a triangle, right? There'd be a mono drum in front of you and 2 guitars in the back, and there'd be no front soundstage. That would sound wrong, I think.
Right.
Or you could put the guitars in the front, and then there would be not enough in the back. There'd be nothing in the back until the backing vocals come in. So in the 5-1 mix that Steven Wilson did of that song, the compromise he came up with was to put the guitars in the phantom sides in 5-1. So there are these 2 guitar parts, they're mixed between the front and back speakers. So it sounds like there's kind of enough energy around you, but it's not pulling away too much from the front of the room. But in the Atmos version, there's actually speakers in the side. You could stick those guitars in. And I like the precision of having a spot next to you where things like stay and they don't move when you move your head. So I think you could take just about any like simple rock record, like a rock combo with, 2 guitars or like a guitar and a keyboard. And if those parts were hard panned, like say you're listening in stereo, it's, drums are across the stereo fields. There's like a guitar on each side or guitar on one side, keyboard on the other. You could take those parts and put them in the side speakers in an Atmos mix, and it sounds like you're in the middle of it, but it doesn't sound like it's too pulled apart. So I really like the side speakers.
Yeah, I would agree. I definitely like the side speakers. I mean, my personal taste, and it's probably the Bob influence on me just in general. Imaging is really important to me. Like at the Immersive event we were at in Nashville, depending on where you sat in the room for some of the mixes that people would play, like I know I was sitting maybe a little more towards the back because I got into a session late, and when they started playing a song, like the lead vocal, it didn't feel like it was coming from in front of me. It felt like it was coming from like back and left behind my head because of the way things have been panned, that kind of stuff. For me, it's a little weird and not my personal taste, but I really like strong imaging and, having things stay in places, when you move around the room. But there's times too, though, where sometimes it's cool to have things that are just not as distinct somewhere and they're more decorrelated and all over the place. But I don't expect that with a lead vocal,
Oh yeah, I mean in Bob's mixes the lead vocals are in the center and like nowhere else.
Right. Little bit in the left, little bit in the left and right, but definitely in the center.
That's a whole other point of contention. The vocals in the center and just what to do with the center in general.
We don't need to we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. I like the center channel, and one of the things and this is what's interesting to me with the center channel. I had 2 different interviews I found with Bob. There was one when he first started working in surround, talking about how weird the center channel sounds. And then there was another one maybe 5 to 10 years later, and I think these were both in Sound on Sound magazine. There was another one maybe 5 to 10 years later where he's, raving about the center channel and the imaging and all of that kind of stuff. So, that's where I go with the center channel. And like, I know that there are some people who they're never going to want to use the center channel, and okay, that's fine. But my recommendation to most people is like, just try it, because some of it is a little bit more of an acquired kind of thing. And I always think people who have setups at home who've been listening to these kind of surround and immersive formats for a while, they are used to the center channel, especially if they've been watching, in addition to listening to music, they've been watching movies, TV, like that kind of thing, where the center channel is, it's kind of a big deal in that. But you and I'm sure we've both heard great mixes that use the center channel, and we've both heard great mixes that don't. So,
Exactly.
That's it. there's my center channel.
I mean, the only thing I'll add is that it feels like people are kind of moving away from it. Aside from these kind of like specialty mixers, like Clear Mountain and Wilson and a few others, and I think the reason for that isn't necessarily that people don't like the sound of it. It's just a lot of the stems are stereo. So like if you
Right.
get sent a stereo stem that has the vocal and like a stereo effect on it, like it doesn't make sense to cram all of that in the center. I mean, I think the best compromise is you could just kind of, with the Pro Tools panel, you could just kind of narrow it a bit so it touches the center and the front.
Yeah, you can do that. I think even using the divergence is,
Yes.
that'll work even a little better to put a little bit in the center. I know early on there were recommendations. Some of the labels didn't want you using the center channel because they were afraid that people would, basically go out and rip the center stuff to use for remixes or whatever they want to do. And I don't think that matters as much these days because there's so much software out there that will stem split these days anyways.
Yes.
If somebody wants to get that lead vocal out of a stereo mix, they're going to go grab it. I'm not personally as worried about that anymore, but that's a whole other thing, I think.
I mean, I'm not gonna lie, like when I'm demoing surround to people, like I do like to sort of isolate the center and show people just the vocal on some of these, iconic albums. It is fun.
Yeah.
I know it's not what the mixers intend, but it's a little fun little extra feature.
Yeah, I've done that, Rocket Man, which
Oh
is
yeah.
kind of that's like one of the early benchmark Atmos mixes, and it's a center channel vocal.
That's one of those ones. Yeah, the vocal is totally naked in the center. I think there are no sounds in the center in that mix other than the vocal.
Yeah, and he sounds great. So
Yeah, totally.
so kind of got two questions here as we're kind of starting to wrap this up.
Okay.
One was a question that some of my friends were wondering. They're just wondering, like, have you seen any kinds of sales trends with immersive music since you started? And I think a question that sort of ties into that and into some of what we've been talking about here. Do you feel like Atmos has succeeded or is succeeding where 5.1 and Quad kind of maybe, I mean, I hesitate to say failed, but maybe didn't quite catch on the same way people had hoped for back then?
I mean, 5.1 never really went away. Like, I mean, the big labels kind of got out of it maybe around 2009, 2010. But throughout, the 2010s, there were new 5.1 discs coming out. I mean, we talked about the King Crimson and XTC stuff.
Right.
One of my favorite bands, whose music we sell on the site, a band called the Pineapple Thief. If you're familiar with them, the lead singer, a guy called Bruce Sword, does all the mixing for them, and he's done some mixes for other bands too. But they started releasing all their albums in 5.1 during like the mid 2010s. So it sort of became this cause of like indie artists. And then, you started to see like the box sets that would come with surround mixes of there were like, the early albums by the band that Bob did the mixes for, like Big Pink and Stage Fright. Those when they reissued those, around 2017, 18, those all came with Blu-rays with 5.1, the Beatles stuff, the Tears for Fears albums. So it seemed like I said, for since I got into 5.1 with each year, it seemed like there were more things coming out, all building to the point during the pandemic when Atmos like exploded. And I would say the same thing for Atmos. Since it's become a thing, there have been more physical releases every year than the past. As far as like sales of IA stuff, we have seen an upward trend every year. Otherwise, like we wouldn't still be doing this. I mean, I'm not going to give you like specifics,
Right.
but there is an upward trend we can point to. The notoriety of the music we've been getting has been growing with every year. When I started working there in June of 2021, I think we had like 50 albums for sale, and now we have over 500. And we have, we've gotten some pretty famous albums. We talked about the Ray Charles Genius Loves Company. Recently, we did the Pixies Doolittle album from the 90s. Yeah, So I think, yeah, I think there is definitely like a growing trend. And as far as like the industry's overall, investment in this, I think too much money has been spent on marketing and promoting it that they can't just pull the plug on it tomorrow. Like I think it's going to be around for a while.
That's something I like to hear because I love listening to it and I love working on it. So yeah, that's all great to hear.
Yeah, I mean that's just kind of my observations from being sort of tapped into what's going on with it, especially on the consumer side. I mean, the other thing I will say is that there was kind of like, as you may know, there was a huge rush to kind of populate the streaming services with mixes around, 2019, 2020. And a lot of those mixes were not good. And a lot of them have since quietly disappeared or been replaced with better versions. So I think the overall art of mixing in Atmos, the quality of mixes has improved since 2020, 2021. There
Yeah.
aren't that many times now where like I'll flip on a new album in Apple Music and I'll be like, oh my God, like how did this make it past quality control? I mean, there are some things I disagree with. Like sometimes I think, it's not adventurous enough or something. But I mean, some of those early mixes were really bad. So yeah.
All right, before I wrap this up, is there anything that we didn't talk about that you want to make sure we get in there?
Well, I could say that right now IA is also offering a mixing service. So like you could send us stems and we could do a mix for you. This is a new thing we're offering. So if anyone is interested in that, get in touch with me. But overall, like, I think you've got nothing to lose by selling through the site because there's no cost involved in getting set up. And it's a way to earn more revenue from the Atmos mix. And, you could potentially even make back whatever you've invested in it just through IA sales. I guess one other thing really is another thing that I feel is important on the site is just publicity. Because it's interesting how little there is written on the internet about Atmos mixes, unless you go on these forums and things. So there's a lot written about like why Atmos is great and why you should buy stuff that has it. Like you can read all these things like they say it's like a three-dimensional approach to listening, and but there isn't a lot written about like what Atmos music mixes really sound like. And there isn't a lot of promotion done when a new album is released in Atmos. Like they just kind of drop it on streaming services. And
Right.
they'll say in a press release, like, yeah, there's an Atmos mix. So kind of what I've been trying to achieve with the site is, as you've seen, I do these reviews where I kind of
Mm-hmm.
try to give people like a rundown of what it sounds like on an Atmos system. Like I'll be like, the guitar comes from over there and the drums come over there. And I guess my hope is that maybe someone will come across this who's only heard an Atmos mix in headphones and they'll think like, huh, guitars behind me, backing vocals in the ceiling. Like, oh, I kind of want to hear that. Like, I'm hoping it'll kind of intrigue people and get them interested in like exploring the speaker part of it.
Yeah, I think a lot of us would love more people to hear things on speakers because, I'm glad there's a headphone component out there and that, we can take what we've done on speakers down to headphones so people can experience some of that. But the speaker thing, I mean, I've never had anybody come into my studio and walk away like, no thanks. It's always everybody's always amazed, and some people are mad because they're mad that I played it for them because they're like, how can I go back now? How can I,
Yeah.
So, and it's like, yeah, now you know how I feel about it, because that was how
Exactly.
I felt when I started hearing it. It's like, yeah, this is like, why would you not want to hear music this way? But
It's almost better to listen to when you listen to the binaural without having heard the speaker mix first, because you're approaching it like with an open mind and you're not trying to think about how, because you already know where all the stuff is supposed to be.
right.
Like if you know there's supposed to be like a guitar solo in the ceiling and nowhere else, like it doesn't sound like that in headphones. It does sound like the guitar is in a place that's not quite tied to the middle of your head, It's interesting. Like I've tried to describe
Yeah.
to people what binaural sounds like, and in a lot of cases, it is more interesting than just listening in regular stereo. Like I
Yeah, I
wouldn't
think
discourage
so.
anyone from listening to binaural.
No, and
Certainly.
I think, the binaural thing, I think people externalize it to different degrees. I mean, there are times where I hear stuff all around me and behind me, and there's other times where I don't. The way I usually think about it or might explain it to somebody, I feel like listening in binaural is a little bit closer to listening on speakers because you don't have like, if something was hard panned off on one side, it's not like just all that ear. It actually feels it feels more normal to me since I spent all my life listening on speakers. The other weird thing though is like I was on a plane maybe a month and a half ago, and I was listening to the Boy Genius record, and the Atmos came on in my headphones on the plane. I thought my daughter was singing along next to me at first, and I couldn't like my first thought was, how does she know exactly what song I'm listening to and exactly where in the song? And then I went, oh no, that's the record. Like, and it was doing that thing. So, it's a different experience, I think, for different people, but I typically prefer it to the stereo. Plus, there's usually more low end in it because it hasn't been limited to within an inch of life itself.
Yes.
And the drums actually can have some punch because you haven't lopped every transient completely off, theoretically.
It
But
depends on what stems they get. There
that's
are some
true.
records where you could tell like all that was done in the mix, and even the Atmos still has that sound. And then there
Yep.
are other ones where you're like, wow, like I can't believe it was recorded this well. Funny
Right.
enough, you mentioned Boy Genius. We're gonna be releasing Lucy Dacus's solo record on
Oh,
IA.
cool.
It's called Home Video.
Mm-hmm.
The Atmos mix was done a long time ago, like in 2021 or 2022. And I just had that experience. I was listening to it last night, and the stereo version of that record is like smashed to bits, like most new records are. But the Atmos is like super dynamic. Like I wonder if it was even mixed from like an unprocessed multitrack. It sounds completely different. Going off another thing you were saying about
Mm-hmm.
like when things are hard panned and binaural, one of the things that's interesting is if you put like say you put something in one of the front speakers, like you have like I don't know, you say you got double track guitars in the front speakers. When you put that into binaural, it's actually going to sound narrower than it would in regular stereo because it's trying to like throw them in front of you instead of them being like right at your ears. It's just an interesting thing to account for when you're mixing because sometimes like you think you've got it perfect on speakers, and then when you put on the headphones and you're like, whoa, like something's really loud or something's really quiet. And yeah, and the headphones don't necessarily lie. Like if you're listening to your mix and the drums are like 3 dB too loud on headphones, they're probably too loud.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just think you do have to be careful working on the headphones right now because it's still a little bit of a moving target, and they are changing things and making it better. But yeah, I know for me checking things on headphones, I think it's important for sure, but it's definitely been helpful too.
But
So
I think you and I agree that the headphones are like they come at the end of the process. It's like where you finish the mix, not where you start it.
yeah, that's where
Yeah.
that's my thing. The thing the thing on speakers right now, like if I was gonna say what is my biggest pet peeve with Atmos mixes right now is if I am sitting in my spot or really anywhere in the room, and if I move my head a couple of inches and everything goes swishy, like that kind of phase stuff really bugs me. And that's why I think like, and usually when I hear that, I feel like, okay, somebody was only working in headphones on this and they didn't really check it in the speakers because it's pretty, like if you're in a 714 room that stuff is pretty obvious when it starts doing that. And, maybe they like it. Maybe some people like it. Like it's a cool, you can sit there and kind of generate your own effects because it'll, phase and flange and do all that kind of stuff as you move your head.
For me, the telltale sign is like when there's like absolute separation between parts. Because when you
Yeah.
hard pan things in headphones, it's not as obvious as it is on speakers. So in a lot of these, like especially if you're mixing from stems, it's like all the drum sound is in the front and nowhere else. Like if you shut off the fronts, there would be no drums. And that you don't really notice it on headphones, but usually on speakers, I find, especially with those kind of sounds like drums and bass, if you don't let them like spill over to the back a little bit, like not all
Mhm.
the way, but just like a little bit of bleed, it sounds very like unglued. It's like all of a sudden the whole mix is in the front, and then like these things come blasting out of the sides, like just during the chorus, then the sides go silent again.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's something that I know. I wouldn't say it's a thing that gets debated with engineers, but I know with some of the other guys working in Atmos, we have discussed about, there are some songs. Sometimes if you pull it apart, it feels pulled apart and it doesn't feel immersive. Other times pulling it apart makes it feel immersive. And
Yeah.
it just depends on the music. It depends on how it was recorded and what you have to work with. And there's a lot of different variables, I think, on why that kind of stuff works sometimes and why it doesn't. But my preference for sure is usually for things to be as adventurous as they can. I mean, that was one of the things, early on when I was first starting to mix in here, I had pulled up Elliot Shiner's mix of Hell Freezes Over by the Eagles, which was the first, and that was the first 5/1 mix I think he ever did.
For him, that was a comparatively conservative mix. I
Yeah,
mean, it's
yeah,
also a live
no,
album. Yeah.
that's true. But I just remember hearing in that, like, and that was a live recording.
Yeah.
And just thinking about, it's like, oh, he put some instruments in the back. Well, I mean, gee, if he can do that, I can totally do that. And that really kind of helped me. And then the same with Bob. I've got some 5/1 stuff that he did. And, listening to that, it's like, okay, if these guys, they're engineers that I think most of us hold in high regard and would call legends, if they're not afraid to put things into places all over the room, maybe I shouldn't too. But it doesn't always, like, you can't just throw stuff. It's like, oh, I'm going to
Exactly.
put this here and I'm going to put this here and this here. It doesn't always work. You actually have to listen and use some
You have
taste.
to, yeah, you have to like think about it and listen and make decisions. And it's one
Yeah.
of the reasons why I don't think like AI can do this. 'Cause people have asked me like, do you think like you could just load an AI program and have it make an Atmos mix from stems? And like, yeah, probably, but it's not going to be good because there has to be some degree of like human judgment, I think, in order to get the best sounding results.
Yeah, I'm down with that.
Yeah.
So, well, Jonathan, it has been great talking to you. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the easiest way to do that?
Well, I would say at immersiveaudioalbum.com, there's like a contact us button. I think the email address is just hello@immersiveaudioalbum.com, and that's an easy way to get in touch with me because I answer all the support emails. And yeah, if you've got if you've got an album mixed in Atmos and it's you own it and you want to make a little more money off of it, by all means get in touch with me.
Thanks so much for sticking around for the whole video. And once again, thank you to Jonathan for coming by. I really enjoyed chatting with him. If you like this format, you think I should talk to some other people involved in immersive audio, please let me know down below in the comments. I've got some other ideas, but let me know what you think. Leave a comment down below. But thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.